Anoushka, thank you for joining us for Soundtrack's Quick Hits.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Can you talk about the flamenco? Why flamenco?
It's a good question. Why not flamenco? But why, I suppose, was simply because I love it. Indian classical music is obviously the style of music that I have played for many years and studied, and that's predominantly what I do as an Indian musician. But I do very much listen to music from all around the world and from all time periods, modern and old. And flamenco is something that's always really spoken to me. It's something I've always loved and progressively felt more and more curious about.
Tell us about Inside Me.
It's about being pregnant, actually. I wrote it, I think I was about 6 or 7 months pregnant by that point, and we were working on the record from the beginning of my pregnancy. And so it had been as you can imagine, it had been a really, really important part of the entire process. And progressively, I was feeling my baby move more and more, and he became a real part of the recording process for me, because anytime we'd start working on the music, I'd feel him start to kick and dance, in response to the music that we were playing. So it was this really weird twofold process of like him responding to the music and him inspiring me to make the music. It was really an amazing experience for me, but Inside Me, the lyrics are about feeling a life dancing inside of you and the joy of that. And so it's a very buoyant, very, happy song.
You think that maybe when he's like 4 or 5 years old, he might hear the album and think, Mom, that sounds kind of familiar to me.
I did exploit it, actually. I started playing it to him right when he was born, and kind of had the hope that it would be really specially soothing, calming music to help him sleep,
And did it work?
It seemed to.
Well,
but he likes
good.
music in general, so I don't know.
So it seems that while you're going out and playing, adventurous music, fusion and different styles, when you play Indian classical music, you maintain a real kind of purity in your approach when you play that. And I'm wondering, how do you approach that consciously in that way, or how does that work?
It's a really good question. I don't get asked that. I have to think.
Is it true?
It's true. I'd like it to be true. I feel like that's what I strive for. I really value tradition. And I think that tradition and creative expression and modernity don't have to be mutually exclusive. I think they can exist together, and I think it's important to carry music forward that's old and has its roots generations and generations before, because I think that has value for people, And at the same time, all artists need to be creative, and music needs to evolve. It needs to be relevant to people and to the artists as a product of today and this very moment. And I think that duality is something that really does fascinate me. I've been privileged to receive such amazing classical training. So perhaps if I hadn't had that, I wouldn't feel the same way. But through learning from my father, I've been given such amazing knowledge of such a beautiful old form. I've learned from the most amazing exponent of it. And that is something I feel keen to pass on and to share with people.
I think not a lot of people in the West realize that when your father first started to experiment with other forms of music, with Western music, he got a lot of grief about that from purists in India. And I'm wondering, have things changed much? Or do you get a hard time at all from
No.
purists in the Indian tradition?
I mean, there's some purists who probably write me off and don't think very much of me, but for the most part, Indian classical music is thriving within the classical communities, but in the grand scheme of the Indian market, it's not doing very well because it has to compete with the juggernaut of Bollywood music. And so practically any classical musician that wants to make a living ends up doing these kind of fusion concerts and crossover things, and and it's like when it's genuine, that's great, and if it's something people have to do in order to do well, that's a real shame. But it is so much the norm. You were right to mention my father. When he did it, he was the first person to do it, and it was decades ahead of anyone else. And so at that point, it was unheard of, and it was very shocking, and it was very controversial. And it's funny because if you look back, what he was doing was so different from crossover today. What he was doing was sort of spreading Indian music around the world. And so even when he would work with Western musicians or Western orchestras, if you look at the music, it's actually purely Indian music being played by different musicians and different instruments. Whereas today it is more about a two-way dialogue. And it's funny to look back and think that that was so pioneering and undone at the time.
Yeah, he was just going and playing, Hindustani ragas out in the West, and like you said, playing traditional music.
Yeah.
Has this album, the flamenco album, have you had any word of like the reception in India?
It's done really well. We this American tour is on the back of a 30-city European tour and a sort of 15-city Indian tour. So we've been there, and it was received really well. I mean, there's very little knowledge of flamenco in India, and so it was interesting to kind of do this show somewhere like Spain, where it was the Indian music that was unknown, and then to go and do it in India where it was the flamenco that was unknown. And yet it seems to, it feels like it's connected.
The title of the album is Traveler. What does that mean for you?
It's just me. I don't really yet know how to stay still and not be a traveler. I mean, I was raised across 3 continents. But even outside of living in 3 countries, I was always touring. I started touring as a sitar player from when I was 13, but from much younger, I was traveling with my father. So even while living simultaneously in 3 places, it was also moving into other countries as a musician. And so that whole idea of traveling gypsies, traveling musicians when doing this project was something that in a modern context I really connect to. And so it's me, it's the music, it's the role of the sitar on this record, but it's also, I think, a little nod to traveling people of the past and how influential they've been.
And you're traveling with your son now, right? The way that your father traveled with you. Do you think, are you going to teach him music and bring him up the same way? Because it seemed like it worked out pretty well for you. Yeah,
I have to see. If he wants it, then great. But at least as of now, I don't feel like I want to teach him so much that it would be if he didn't want to learn. It feels like if he wants it, great, but if he doesn't, that's fine. I don't know. Ask me in 10 years.
Well, it's Hindustani music. Don't you have to start, learning the rhythms at like 2?
Well, the earlier the better. But there's so much of imbibing and really just immersing yourself in the atmosphere as opposed to really learning, and that can happen from birth.
Right.
I mean, just the act of him coming to shows and listening is learning, and that can happen, all the time.